Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of what's very different to what I usually do. There have been a lot of new reviews about the iMac M1 and I began to wonder, do I regret not waiting for that and buying that, considering I just bought the Mac Mini M1 in January of this year. Of course, yes, I do regret not waiting for it, purely because it brings back a lot of memories of the colorful iMacs back in '98 when Apple sort of relaunched with that new image. But I did begin to wonder from a logical standpoint rather than a nostalgic one about whether the Mac Mini makes more sense than the M1 iMac. And these were my reasons for going for this at an early stage rather than waiting it out. A big reason for me moving on to the new M1 systems was because I was still using an old MacBook Pro 17-inch from 2011. And I still have it, it still works perfectly fine. But it wasn't exactly fast, to say the least, compared to today's standards. And I did start this channel with this computer, so I do love this. It's dear to my heart. It did start acting up a lot because I did start using videos on iMovie and eventually I moved on to Final Cut Pro. That ended up being too much for this because I mean it was just 1080p that I was working on and I still am. This did start freaking out a lot, but having said that, this has put in good service, almost a decade long worth of service. The display did give me trouble maybe when it was almost about 3 years. But I did have the Apple extended warranty, which did cover the screen, thankfully. Otherwise, that would have set me back. And then a few years later, a lot of people had glitching with video. Turns out a whole lot of people signed petitions to have this rectified by Apple, and Apple did do that. And they did have a program where they swapped out the logic boards of the MacBook Pro 17 inches. So it basically got a new lease in life, and technically the logic board I think should be about 5 years old now, but it boots eventually and it still works fine. I still love this, I'm still keeping it, but it wasn't perfect for videos. Enter the M1. Apple announced the M1 series last year sometime, and of course I was quite skeptical about it, purely because it was first gen. Usually when there's first gen, there are a lot of hiccups. I eventually did go for this because the night before I head out to consider buying an iMac, all the reviews started pouring out about the M1 chips and they were absolutely superb. So I did buy this and I can honestly say I've had no regrets. Now the thing is, with the new iMac M1, they're technically the same hardware. I mean, granted, it's an all-in-one system. You do get your keyboard and mouse with that. With this, you have to buy it separately unless you have your own setup. According to Geekbench scores in some reviews, the new M1 in the iMac is maybe a 2 or 3% faster than the Mac Mini. I don't think that's too significant for an upgrade or to think about discarding this. Let me tell you why I think the Mac Mini M1 still makes sense over the iMac. The absolute base model, nobody is recommending because it has very little I/O ports. I think it's only 2 Thunderbolts. Whereas if you go for the mid spec or the top spec, you get at least 4 Thunderbolt ports. So I wouldn't recommend the base model. If you just need basic usage and you want something pretty in your room, yes, the base model makes sense. Having said that though, it only comes with 256 GB storage and 8 GB unified memory. If you want a more powerful system, you have to consider 16 GB of memory. So now let's consider the second tier purely because it comes with the 8-core CPU and GPU, much like the Mac Mini M1. And I'll go into customize that. When I go into customize this specific one, it starts at 1,40,000. And when you customize it to a 16 GB memory, it goes up plus 20 grand, which makes it 1,60,000. And then of course the storage is up to you if you want 256 GB or if you want 512. So every time you add a larger hard drive, you bump it up by about 20,000 bucks. So let's say 512 is respectable, so that makes it 1,80,000. For the sake of comparison, I'll say it's the same as my Mac Mini, which is a 16 GB memory and 1 TB SSD. So that makes this 2 lakhs worth. This is not including the Apple protection plan. I think the Apple protection plan for the iMac should be at least between 15 to 20,000. Let's round it off at 20,000. That makes it 2,20,000. Let's move on to the Mac Mini. Let's say same specs, the Mac Mini M1 with 16 GB of RAM and a 1 TB SSD works out to 1,25,000. The Apple protection plan on this works out to another 10,000. So that's 1,35,000. So 1,35,000 compared to 2 lakhs 20 was it? You have a lot more headroom for buying the other accessories if that is within your budget. So yeah, you can get a 4K screen. It's not going to be as high res as the iMac screen, yes, but you can get more real estate. You can get a 27 inch, a 32 inch 4K screen within that budget. You can also get a good keyboard, a good mouse, and you'll have money left in your bank to buy a good set of speakers. So all in all, you can have a very nice setup. And another thing, if you buy the iMac, you are stuck with a glossy screen. There's no option of getting a matte screen. Whereas if you're buying third-party monitors, you can choose whether you want matte screens or glossy screens. So if you've got a very bright room, you can always just get a matte screen. It sorts out your issues so much better. So when it comes to value for money, the Mac Mini, I think, still is the king when it comes to any Apple product out there. It's so much more value than any Intel processor that Apple has to offer right now. And when it comes to a performance factor, now I haven't done any 4K work on Mac Mini M1s, but it's funny, it's like a lot of the reviewers have forgotten how well the Mac Mini M1 performs. People were reviewing 4K footage on it and it had no issues at all. So if you're looking at performance, I'd say the Mac Mini. If you're looking at a basic desktop just to check your emails and whatever else, I'd still say the Mac Mini because it hardly takes up any space. If, however, you are more into statement, the iMac M1 has so much more pomp and flair compared to this little thing, because this isn't even seen on my desk. I keep it in the keyboard tray, so it's not even visible. Whereas the iMac with its various colors, it does look quite funky. It is nice to look at, no doubt, and it is definitely a statement factor. When it comes to the performance and I/O, I quite like the Mac Mini because it's got 2 USB-As, and I do have things that need to be plugged in via USB-A, and it has 2 Thunderbolt ports. It does have an HDMI port and it can support up to a 6K monitor. It does have active cooling, but the iMac does come with 2 fans instead of the one like the Mac Mini. But I've never really heard this thing getting uncomfortable. It's never really been spooling way out of control. I can only hear it when things get really quiet late at night. It's always sort of spinning on idle, so it's never really been a problem. When it comes to speakers though, the iMac has a much larger space in its structure for better sounding and larger speakers. The Mac Mini though, it's not too great. It's just one little speaker that's good enough for a startup chime. I have heard iPhones that sound considerably better than this. Now over the almost last 6 months that I've been using this, I have had no issues with it whatsoever. A lot of people did complain about having Bluetooth issues with the Mac Mini M1, but I somehow got lucky and didn't have any of those. It's worked flawlessly for me. In fact, I've learned a lot more than I think I would over the old 17-inch MacBook Pro, because it just works blazingly fast, especially compared to that. I've jumped 10 years into the future when it comes to computing with the M1 Mac Mini. I have paired a 27-inch 4K monitor with this Mac Mini. If I had gone for the iMac M1, I would have 24 inches, or at least Apple claims it's 24, whereas it's actually 23.5. So I do feel that little extra space does help when it comes to having an external screen, especially for video, because a slightly larger screen is better when it comes to any form of editing. So I'd just like to conclude by saying that the Apple Mac Mini M1 is the most value for money Macintosh that is available today. You can always go for the iMac if you'd like. If you've got the money to throw and you want that statement factor, it does make sense. But if you pick up the absolute budget version of this machine, I've heard it's still more than capable of handling 4K editing, so it's bound to be okay with your emails for many years to come. No doubt there's a lot of talk about the new M1X and the M2 chips that are about to come out, but if you're playing that waiting game, you're going to end up waiting forever, and that's a big reason why I just decided to stop working on my 17-inch MacBook Pro and just go for what Apple had to offer then. So in short, if you want a powerful computer and you don't want to spend too much and you really want value for money, this is the computer to go for. So please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and thank you for tuning into Paul's POV for some sound advice.